Okay, so welcome to the Uncomfortable Knowledge Hub. Today we have our first webinar with an invited speaker. So this is the first time we do it. And we hope that this will be the first of a long series of interesting discussion with all of you. Before presenting our speaker and the topic of the webinar, I have 3 points for those that are not familiar with the Uncomfortable Knowledge Hub. First, what is this website? Is the legacy of a European project, MAGIC, moving to adaptive governance in complexity, that for years has been checking the quality of the narratives used to inform sustainability policy in the European Union. So what the MAGIC project discovered is that there is an elephant in the room in the ongoing process of decision making, that is in the European Union. We are continuously framing our sustainability policy considering only rosy scenarios. Only, yes, we can, there are no problems. In a few years, we will have a painless and quick transition to a low carbon economy. Unfortunately, it is becoming more and more evident that policy based on wishful thinking simply do not work. So this means that there are a lot of problems, and then uncomfortable knowledge should be used in a creative way rather than exercised. In the sense, we should learn how to use uncomfortable knowledge rather than pretending that there are no problems. A second point is there is something new in our proposal, is that we should discuss of sustainability in a different way. We propose an approach called quantitative storytelling. That is, we do not claim to present the truth, or nor that all the numbers that we are using in our stories are uncontested. When discussing sustainability, the numbers are always contested because they can calculate in different ways, and the chosen narratives are always contested. So the goal of quantitative storytelling is to present alternative points of view that are useful to enrich the diversity of perspective about a given issue. So the usefulness of quantitative storytelling doesn't depend on the rigor of the calculation of specific indicators, but on the ability to stimulate a reflection on important aspects of sustainability problems that at the moment are neglected. The last observation for those that are not familiar with the website is that if you go in, you get into the website from outside, you will see that there are different examples of quantitative storytelling that they are being developed during the MAGIC activities. They are based on a combination of cartoons, short video, lecture, papers. And if you didn't do it, you could go there and having a tour. And if you like our quantitative storytelling, please send us your feedback. We would like to open a dialogue with a growing community of people willing to improve the quality of the discussions about our sustainability crisis, and not about bitching or who is right, who is wrong with numbers. Now, moving to the speaker of today, our speaker is Gail Ferber. She is a guru of quantitative storytelling. She has been flagging the existence of uncomfortable knowledge for almost 20 years, first collaborating with the Old Drum, and then now with their own blog, ourfinalworld.com. She's been involved in many talks, workshops, university courses, scientific conference. And what is special of Gail, and I'm really happy that she will be our first speaker, is that she's not coming from academia, as many of us. She knows economics, but she doesn't believe in complicated economic models. She knows energy, but she doesn't use complicated thermodynamic reasoning. Gail mixes institutions, intuition, knowledge, and data using her own wisdom. In fact, she has been an insurance actuary, a field in which you have to use robust data, but at the same time, a lot of common sense. So it is important to have her contribution because Gail looks at the forest rather than at the individual trees, something that as academicians we tend to at times not to do. So coming to the topic, Gail will give us her own quantitative storytelling about really uncomfortable knowledge. That is, what if it is too late for a smooth transition to a low carbon economy? What if the complexity of our society keeps us locked in the existing status quo, making it impossible to have a planned, smooth adjustment? Should we expect a collapse of our economy, the way we know it, as a necessary step to construct a different economy? As a matter of fact, a collapse should not scare us. The Soviet Union collapsed, and they didn't experience a total destruction of their social practice, their identity, or wild violence in the street. It's not going back to the Stone Age. However, Soviet Union had to collapse to have the new Russia. So the question for Europe, that is, we are getting the opinion from a person from the States, is how plausible is the current plan looking for a radical rearrangement of the European economy in 10 or 20 years that is expected to happen because we are dropping here and there a few subsidies, some regulation. Can we believe the new business model and technical innovation will solve all our problems that are systemic problems? So that this is the end of my introduction. Please again note that the webinar is recorded, and then you should write comments or discussion points in the chat, so that at the end, if Gail keeps it in 45 minutes, we should have 30 minutes to address the comments we receive. So without further ado, I leave the stage to Gail.
Well, thank you, Mario. Let me try to share my screen. Is this working?
Yes, yes, working, perfect.
And you can hear me.
Yes.
So today I'd like to talk about the topic, the economy is approaching near-term collapse, not peak oil. The result is quite different from what people had assumed that peak oil might look like. It might not just be the peak oilers, it might be what government officials are thinking too. This is an outline of the topics I plan to talk about. First is how economic growth leads to collapse. I've really kind of pieced this together from looking at information from a variety of different stories. Second is what peak oil theory misunderstands. And it's not just what peak oil theory misunderstands, it's really the same story that most people misunderstands. That has to do with, you know, if we can see resources there, can we extract them? And prices allow us to do this. So you end up with a range of views, which aren't really all peak oil theories. Then the third part is where we are today relative to collapse, a few charts, and then some implications for biophysical economics. I should say the reason I chose biophysical economics was because that's the group I'm more familiar with. I would say that there are implications for all of these different energy researchers. You know, the idea that the levelized cost of electricity from different sources, you know, this is distorted too if you don't have the right overhead kind of costs going in there. So there's many others. There's nothing particular to biophysical economics in terms of, you know, all of them really have to be looked at more carefully. So let me start first with how economic growth leads to collapse. The way I view the economy is sort of like a child's toy, building toy that you keep building layers on, up higher and higher and higher. And it's a physics-based system that we don't even realize is operating the whole time. It includes businesses and new businesses that are added and old businesses that go away. It includes governments, it includes consumers, it has interest rates and market prices, but it's all of these things keep changing and adding, but at the same time, some of the bottom, the way this structure is really hollow, the bottom is disappearing. For instance, we no longer make buggy whips for horses because we're not using horse and buggy anymore. everything keeps changing. And I'll explain a little more on the next slides. Did I get to, yeah. So as I said, we had the new businesses and the governments, but the resources are very important. And there's lots of different kinds of resources like metal ores, fresh water, adequate fertile farmland, and energy is needed for every aspect of GDP. Of course, it's needed for heating things and for moving things. The fact that the wages of employees are used to buy things is very, very important. There's not an exact equality between employees and consumers, but if you have too much wage disparity, you suddenly get into a big problem. What happens is if you have too much wage disparity, then what happens is the very low paid people can't afford to buy the output of the economy. And you start having a situation where the 1% or the 10% are getting the overwhelming output of the economy, and the people who are getting very low pay get very unhappy. They may riot, they may try to overturn their government, and their poor eating habits may make them susceptible to epidemics. The biggest problem is really a two-way problem. It's the population rises as the resources deplete. And so what happens is the resources per capita fall. And this is the fresh water fall per capita falls. It's all of the different kinds of resources per deplete. And you can kind of visualize what happens with my little chart as to what would happen if you had a farming economy and each farmer was given an equal plot of land. And you can see on the left here, I have shown a situation where the population isn't too dense and each farmer gets a fairly good sized plot of land so he can feed his family well. Well, what people would logically think is, well, if we have more people, you know, these families have more than 2 children on average, then the population grows, and what you would end up with is smaller and smaller plots. Well, it doesn't really work that way, because if you go to smaller and smaller plots, what happens is nobody has enough. And so all of the population would starve. And the way the economy works, or the way evolution works, is it's set up so that there's variation. And so you get unequal distribution. So the way we get this unequal distribution has to do with added complexity. And this is a workaround for inadequate resources per capita. And we can think of a lot of different examples of inadequate resources per capita. For example, more technology. And that technology can allow greater efficiency. So we're talking about new machines, better machines, fancier, bigger trucks. And then another kind of complexity is these longer, more tightly connected supply lines. And I have down a couple of items here. I talk about growing international trade. So these tightly connected supply lines can even go around the world. And we end up with bigger governments and bigger businesses. So they can all get in the act as well. And we end up adding intermittent electricity. And we put together models saying that this is going to work. And then we need to put together complex financial systems to try to pay for all of these things, which are built with today's resources, hoping that they will work for 20 or 50 or whatever number of years in the future. The thing that we forget, that people don't pay attention to, is that adding too much complexity tends to lead to collapse because of diminishing returns to complexity. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Joe Tainter. He wrote the book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, back in 1988. And he points out that what happens is that, each of these civilizations ran into some kind of problems, and maybe they added, different kinds of things, a new dam so that they have more water so their farms would be more productive, or whatever it is. But what happened is all of this complexity they added led to wider wage and wealth disparity. And when you do that, you get the managers and the technically skilled get the very much higher pay, and there's little left over for the non-elite workers. I might also point out that part of the output of the goods and services actually go into making these new devices. For instance, the new dam, instead of just making goods directly for the people, they're now making all of these capital goods that have to use the resources of the community as well. Francois Rodier is one of the people that writes about the physics of the situation, because the economy and how it operates is based on physics, even though we don't think of that. You can't make GDP without having energy. And so this is a big part of it. And he says that physics underlies the unequal distribution of resources. And the way evolution is set up is based on survival of the best adapted. And so when you have this unequal distribution, if there's a shortage of resources, then there is going to be a remainder that's going to be able to stick around, even if quite a bit of the population is lost, of whatever it is. You see this in nature all the time. And the way he describes the situation is that it's similar to the situation with water. You have the steam rise to the top and the ice fall to the bottom. One is with heat and one was with freezing, but what tends to happen is that the lowest members of the economy, in some sense, get frozen out. I've given here a few of the examples of added complexity in the early farming situations. Let's see, they build a dam so that the farming is more productive. Excuse me. I've added these examples of added complexity in the farming situation. To build a dam so the farming is more productive. One farmer becomes owner, others are tenants. Some would-be farmers become craftsmen, but you can only carry this so far. As you get bigger and bigger population and the land gets more degraded or whatever the problem is, you run into limits. And what tends to happen is when there are not enough resources to go around, those with the fewest resources get squeezed out. The example that, or one example right now that we're reading about is in Yemen, which of course, it's past peak oil there. They have very little water. Their population mushroomed when they were an oil exporter. And now we read that they have 2 million children who are malnourished, and 12.4 million Yemen children need humanitarian assistance. When we add this complexity with all of these big devices that are made with all of these resources, we need a financial system for time shifting purposes. Some examples of time-shifting financial devices are bank debt, bonds, sale of shares of stock. What happens is that we build these devices with resources, today's resources, including today's workers, but the benefit comes in the future. And the only way that you can pay those workers is you have to be able to promise them future goods and services, because what you're doing is really promising goods that aren't yet available, and which is kind of a strange concept. But that's why you need this financial system with the debt, as long as you've got these big devices you're making. Of course, the business people need to build factories in advance, and they need to have the credit for what good that factory is going to have over its lifetime. And even consumers get the benefit if they buy a house or a vehicle or college education. It's a whole lot easier to pay for if they can pay for it over a period of time. So this financial system with all of the debt goes hand in hand with building all of these long-lasting goods. And we stop to think about it, the existing of these time-shifting devices tends to help the rich more than the poor. What happens is the poor pay high interest rates, and ultimately those interest payments tend to float upward and help the bankers and the rich people who are at the top of the pyramid. But the poor people, or the rich people at the bottom of the economy, or the rich people, they can borrow at low interest rates and use the loans for whatever purpose they want, buy themselves a fancy house, speculate in the stock market or whatever, and send their children to fancy schools. So we see lots of uses. They find lots of uses for the available shares of stock and debt. The net impact is that the non-elite workers find themselves worse and worse off as complexity is added. The rich tend to become very, very rich. They own companies with all of their high-tech devices, but they also get paid wages and bonuses. So it's not just that there's wage disparity, there's also this wealth disparity issue. As we get to a more complex economy, what we end up with is a whole class of pensioners, and they get part of the cut of what is made by the economy, the goods and services of the economy. And these pensioners, of course, not making any current goods and services, but they still get to take part of the output of the economy. And what happens is the non-elite workers get the leftovers. And they're still required to purchase health insurance. And in the US, the health insurance doesn't vary by your income. You know, if you still have to pay the same amount if you're making minimum wage or if you're a high wage person. And these non-elite workers find they increasingly have to compete with global workers earning very low wages. So even computer programmers find themselves competing with Chinese and Indian programmers. And what happens is that these non-elite workers find it difficult to have enough money left for buying a home, buying a vehicle, and supporting a family. They tend to live with their parents longer. And what happens with collapse is that this very low wage situation feeds through in different ways and ultimately leads to collapse. For instance, we've already been seeing that these low wage workers become unhappy. They tend to have uprisings. And in fact, the governments may be overthrown. I don't think we get very much information in the US, but I keep seeing comments on my blog from people elsewhere showing, well, back a while ago, we saw these people in protests in Hong Kong, in France, any place you look, you find protests with respect to workers being unhappy about the situation. They want better pensions, they want better whatever it is. What happens, because the workers cannot actually pay very much themselves, you end up with debt defaults. And it passes through the economy. If the people at the bottom aren't able to buy very much goods for businesses, then the next layer up can't do too well either. I mean, the businesses find it hard to earn as much profit as they need. And the governments can't collect enough taxes. It may be that the governments actually collapse rather than that they're being overthrown. Also, what tends to happen is the workers with very low wages tend to eat poorly. And of course, they tend to pack themselves into tight quarters for living. So when you get that combination, your epidemics spread much more easily. And then you also get conflict amongst countries. This isn't really a direct result of the low wages of workers. It occurs because the leaders are trying to they covet each other's resources and jobs, so they start treating other countries differently. You start seeing more tariffs and things, but you can actually get out and out wars. I'm not sure we'd have the same kind of wars as we had years ago. The commodity prices, if you think about it, if 90% of the population, who are the ones that would be buying cars and homes and other things, don't have enough money, and if all of these cars and homes are made with commodities, then commodity prices are likely to be low. And we can look in the Bible at the section in Revelation chapter 18, verses 11 to 13, and it talks about a whole list of items that there was no demand for at the collapse of Babylon, ancient Babylon. And one of the things they mentioned in this whole list of things that there was no demand for was slaves. And of course, that was the energy product of the day that was being traded. So let's look a little bit at least my thoughts on what peak oil theory misunderstands, or maybe what I should say is what 99% of the population misunderstands. They make too many assumptions. And what peak oil theory, or maybe what I'm thinking, it's really based a lot on what the general economic thinking is, that there's a different condition ahead from collapse. And this different condition I would call something like collapse light. It doesn't bring down governments, for example, or nobody thinks about that. In collapse light, a peak in oil supply can occur without the whole economy collapsing. And there seems to be a belief that, well, the quantity of energy in the economy is quite flexible. If it goes down by 80%, well, I'll just use a little bit less. Well, maybe, except if everything is very tightly connected, it doesn't really quite work that way. Another common thing that you see mentioned is that oil supply can decline, but other fuels can take oil's place. So the belief is, well, there seems to be lots of coal resources and there seems to be lots of natural gas resources. So maybe they could take oil's place. In fact, if you assume that prices can go to infinity, which I'm sure no peak oiler would ever assume, but some of the other people would. And then you can assume that you can get all the coal out from underneath the North Sea. But you can assume all kinds of things if you have a high enough price. So the idea is with all of this is that this extraction really will continue beyond peak, because if you can assume high prices, it kind of smooths out the transition. And of course, people think then too that if you understand the resources in the ground for oil, coal, and natural gas, that will determine future extraction. So if the compilation of resources for coal that shows up in the reserves for coal comes out to be 50-year supply, people will assume, well, of course, we're going to pull out that 50-year supply. Our technology will probably improve. Maybe we'll have 100-year supply. And I don't think peak oilers are the ones that do this. I think these are more the government people, but it's the same kind. They take one set of reasoning and they kind of ramp it up. And of course, when you come to that kind of reasoning, then you say climate change is going to be a huge problem. And then another thing I have heard from time to time, especially by people who are just looking at the energy situation, is, well, oh, that financial system is just a man-made thing. It's not terribly important. If the debt collapses, well, we'll just cancel this debt and we'll start out with some new debt and we'll start all over again. And of course, now we've got all these people talking about Bitcoin and local currencies and things. So anyhow, people are still talking in those terms that, well, we can kind of work around it if we have a financial problem. That's what they'd like to think. And then the world leaders, like in the World Economic Forum, they believe that they can control collapse. Like they could say, oh, we'll just transition to renewables, everything will be fine. Well, maybe not so much. One of the issues I think we need to think about is that peak oil theory overlooks the very tightly knit nature of the economy. And the tightly knit nature of the economy is because of the physics of the situation. In physics terms, the economy is a dissipative structure. Some other examples of dissipative structures include ecosystems, hurricanes, all plants and animals, including humans. And they all require energy to grow, and they all eventually collapse. Most of us don't think about the economy as eventually collapsing, but this very much can and does happen. In a way, oil pipelines are like human arteries, and cell phones are like part of the nervous system. And what we find when we look at the situation is all parts of the economy are reaching diminishing returns simultaneously. So not only is oil becoming more expensive to extract in some real sense, but so is coal and natural gas. And fresh water, at least on a per capita basis, we have to use more and more complex techniques to try to get it out and try to make it. We even use desalination, for example. And when it comes to mineral extraction, we find we need to use ores that are of lower and lower quality. And of course, complexity is a favorite problem solver. We'll have bigger machines, we'll do things more efficiently, we'll build big devices that will save us for tomorrow, but they're all reaching diminishing returns. I would add, the medical system is a big thing which is reaching diminishing returns, for example. In fact, here on this chart, at the top, I make a point that really should be a separate slide by itself. The widespread diminishing returns means that the cost of many goods and services rises, but the wages don't rise enough. So what we have is all of these different kinds of goods and services rising in price, but you have a conflict between wages, which on a net basis that get back to all of these people, they don't rise enough for the many poor people of the world. The wealthy people, they do pretty well. And one of the kinds of things that helps cause this situation is things like healthcare costs. These are allowed to rise pretty much without limit in the US. I know in some other countries they're capped a little bit more, but then you have people who are unhappy with the poor quality of the local healthcare system. In the next two slides, I talk a little bit about oil prices not necessarily rising with scarcity. And of course, one of the things is this issue about too many would-be oil consumers have low disposable income. You know, if you're going to, if you have low wages, you're not going to be able to buy a car. You're not going to be able to fill it with gasoline. You're not going to be able to buy a house that needs to be built using trucks carrying goods around across the country. You tend to have repayment of college loans coming first, because the whole education system has been growing, especially in the US, but I think other places too. You know, people used to think education without the university training was sufficient. But now people feel, oh, everyone needs to go to college or university. And that then people, the government in the US is not paying for this directly usually. So then they end up taking out loans, and then that repayment becomes an issue. The healthcare coverage is mandatory in one way or another. And these people end up living at home with their parents longer because they can't afford their own home and a car. And if they could, that would be what would bring up the demand. And of course, now we're seeing government mandates with respect to COVID, that you can't travel, you have to work at home, and sometimes the restaurants are closed. Continuing what I was saying on the previous slide, to some extent, oil prices do rise, but they get beaten back down again. And that's sort of the pattern we've been seeing just recently. The consumers around the world can't afford the higher prices, so it goes up for a little while. And once it goes up for a while, we find, for instance, the people in India, I've been reading, have been cutting down on their oil purchases because they can't afford whatever it is that they can't afford to buy the oil at these new higher prices. And this happens in enough places in the world, and the prices start dropping back down again. So what you get is a zigzag effect, but it doesn't really go up enough. And then a big thing that happens, and it happened back in 2008, is the debt bubble pops. And part of the demand for oil doesn't really come from wages, it comes from the availability of loans for vehicles, new homes, and new factories. And when the debt bubble pops, then the amount of debt goes back down. But what happens is that the price of oil goes down as people buy fewer vehicles, homes, and new factories. And right now, what we're seeing is really what looks like a close to endless rise to debt. And along with this rise in debt is a manipulation by central banks of the interest rates so that they go lower and lower, and they try to make the credit as easy as possible. And of course, they do direct payments in some countries to workers whose wages have been lost, and allowing them to get most of their wages so that somehow or other they can continue to buy things at least for a while. But if this debt bubble collapses, or maybe it's when, then oil prices can be expected to fall. On this next slide, I show charts from a paper which actually I was a co-author of. Qi Wang was the lead author on it. It's called An Oil Production Forecast for China Considering Economic Limits, which was published back in 2015. And what we said was basically that the amount of oil that you can extract depends on how high the price will go. And we had different kinds of oil in China, the resources that we knew about that could be extracted. And some of them needed a very high price and some of them needed a relatively low price. And what we said was we had three scenarios going forward. The red line at the bottom is what we call stays low scenario, where the prices would stay around $50 a barrel. And then we had an ever rising price scenario, which is the yellow line. And then we had something we call the best estimate scenario, which was prices back over $100 a barrel, or in the $100 a barrel range. I'm not sure if we said it exactly that way or not, but prices would immediately bounce back up again. They would not hang around at the low level that they were back in late 2014, 2015. And when we look at the actual production of China, it did indeed go down right after, with the prices staying low, the producers cut back. And this is what you expect. If your prices are low, the producers don't keep producing. They will wait and, maybe the price will go higher, maybe we'll go back to this, but without the high enough price, they tend to cut back. Now I'll show you a few charts with respect to the issue of where we are today relative to collapse. There are many different ways you can look at wage disparity. This chart I'm showing here is really with respect to US wage disparity. And what you can see using this chart is that the wage disparity in somewhat recent years in the US seems to be way back at the level it was back in the 1920s and back in the 1920s in recent years. That's just within the US. But if you really stop and think about it, the wage disparity is an issue worldwide. And so if in a global economy, the situation isn't the same. In a global economy, you have all of these consumers in India and China and Africa that are earning much, much less money. And so when you put those people in it as well, you end up on a worldwide basis of an even wider wage disparity than we used to have back in 100 years ago, where we didn't do as much trading. On this chart, I show the inflation adjusted oil price, and there's really two different points I wanted to make. One of them is that Steve Kopitz wrote an article back, it was back at the beginning of 2014, and what you end up reading from it is that oil companies began complaining about low oil prices back at the time when they were equivalent to about $120 a barrel in inflation adjusted oil prices, which, you're going, what? They started complaining when it was that high? And, it's way back then, they were cutting back on their new investment because they didn't think they could make money on it. So, one of the issues is that we are way below that. the current price is higher than I show on this chart. I think it's what, $67 for Brent, and because this is Brent prices now, but we're still way below the $120 or so that where they were starting to complain about. The other point I was going to make, besides the oil prices, is that the prices depend hugely on what stimulus is being done and what the state of debt is. This 2008 peak occurred right at the time of the collapse of the housing debt bubble. And then if we go down here to 2008, well, at the end of the year, that was when the US began quantitative easing. And this is a way to make the availability of debt greater, the interest rates lower, and so to try to get more money out into the economy. And of course, the government started spending more too, with more debt. And so what happens is that it took a few years, but that gradually pumped it back up again. And then when we get back to here, what we find is that's when the US discontinued its quantitative easing. And you go, oops, well, then the prices come down again. And then, so we go on, and now people are dumping money or debt and more quantitative easing, all kinds of things into the economy. And maybe we're getting up to $66 a barrel or 67, but it's still nowhere near the 120. So there's a big problem, even with all of this manipulation. You can't get it up to where the producers want it. And when you go to coal, you discover it's also suffering from low prices. And here I've got a chart just with some annual averages of a few indexes. Because coal is not as widely traded, we don't see as much information about it. Its prices tend to follow some of the same pattern that the oil prices do. In fact, we find that with natural gas as well. But you see here that the China price is higher than some of the others. Right now, there's a conflict going on with China trying to keep its own coal prices up by keeping other imports down. It's particularly keeping Australia imports down. So what we're finding is that the price of coal in China is relatively a whole lot higher than in Australia. And of course, the boats are waiting outside of China, hoping that they can sell their coal for the higher price they can get in China than what they can get in Australia. But it's all price driven. Now, the big question is, what does it look like going forward? Well, if we look at what the World Economic Forum is, or what do they call it? Yeah, I think it's the World Economic Forum is saying, they're saying that we should get off of fossil fuels by 2050. And, you know, if you assume that maybe you could have your system operate only on renewables, except these renewables won't really run without fossil fuels, but you get it down to a very much lower level by 2050, you have to have a very steep downturn. But I'm afraid even if what they were saying, and even if we didn't try to do this, we're already running into such limits that it would have to come down in some way. I don't know if it goes steeply down this way, or it goes a little bit more this way across and then down. There's a lot of details we don't know, but the basic thing is that it went way up and now it's coming down. There's something interesting too. If you look at this blue line here, you can see the slope is different. It's kind of flatter back here, and then we've got it speeding up, going up quickly here, and it's going down. Well, on the next slide, I'm going to show you, I'll show you kind of a strange way of looking at things, but maybe you can kind of imagine what I'm trying to say is, I looked on each 10-year period and I said, okay, how much does growth is there in energy supplies, and how does that correspond to the growth in population, to the extent we know the growth in population, which is a little iffy, but anyhow. And so what we find is that the growth of population actually takes up quite a lot of the growth in energy supplies. If you've got more energy supplies, population tends to rise more. You spend more on your health care. It's not just so much health care, it's probably trying to get a clean water supply, for example. And so you can help people get better access to clean water, for example, even in Africa, and you can help raise their population, for example. But then besides that part of it, then I said, okay, well, the total, if it was, 1% average growth rate between the 10 years ended 1830 and the 10 years ended 1840, then how much of it went into something else other than population growth, which I called standard of living. But there could also be some combination of other things going on too, I suppose. Efficiency would somehow or other go in here, and maybe you get a little bit more. But what happens is that you have several of these peaks, and we all know there was a period of growth right after World War II, and you can see the peak here. And you can see there was a peak back when we had early electrification, and that was very good. And so then we can see back here, there was, but the problem that happens is that in the periods where there's very low growth, where there was not much more than the population growth, that was when we had the US Civil War, we had World War I, World War II, and the Depression, the Soviet Union collapsed, and now we're seeing COVID. So there's a correlation of bad things happening with low growth rates. The research by Turchin and Nefedov on the collapse leads to a rough timeline. And what we find is that it usually takes over 100 years to expand on the use of a new resource. And with a population growing to a point where whatever resources per capita becomes a problem. And we can think about that in terms of fossil fuels. We've had it for a couple of 100 years. The stagflation stage hits when the carrying capacity is reached. And that stagflation is sort of when you say, oops, well, maybe we have to cut back on maintenance. Maybe we have to add more complexity. We have to become more efficient. And this period lasts for maybe 50 or 60 years. And with respect to the fossil fuels, it probably started in the 1970s or so, but it lasts for 50 or 60 years maybe, or it could be 40 actually, we don't know. There's a lot of variability. And then the crisis stage comes after the stagflation, and that's when you start seeing a steeper down slope. And that's when you start seeing the governments overthrown, the debt defaults, the epidemics, the wars, and the falling population. And one of the things I'm concerned about is that the electric grid is surprisingly close to collapse. And I think that the big issue that people aren't aware of with respect to wind and solar is it's the pricing systems that are really our big problem. And that it's the pricing systems to encourage wind and solar are detrimental to the system. We end up with inadequate pricing for the overall system. So there's a whole lot of corner cutting. If a government takes control and says, look, you've got to have enough backup for this, you got to do this, then your situation can be better. But in California and Texas in the US, that's not been the case. and they've done a lot of corner cutting. So we had a huge recent outage in Texas. And one of the things that was pointed out was that there could be physical damage to the power infrastructure if they had not cut off cut the power and gone to rolling blackouts for days on end for many of the people in Texas. And if they had not been able to do it quickly enough, there would have been physical damage. There could have been fires caused. And it would be, if we only had intermittent wind and solar, we could never repair this. So what are the implications for biophysical economics?
Gail, just one notice. You are already up with your time, so try to be a little bit quicker, otherwise we will not be able to discuss.
Okay. The economies really need to add an increasing quantity of net energy over time if they are not to fail. And I think people look too much at what the EROI is of a particular energy product, but you really need, what we're dealing with is this diminishing returns problem, and what we really need is more and more net energy. And so it's like with inadequate food, you can't just get along without it. And the EROI calculation should only be used to compare energy systems with similar complexity. And I think what we need to do is we need at least three different, probably many different levels of complexity. One would be low, like burned biomass and the power from animals, medium, nuclear, fossil fuels, and high, nuclear, intermittent wind, and solar electricity. We should expect low prices rather than high as limits are reached. The economy is experiencing the historical phenomenon of collapse rather than peak oil. And so we should expect many parts of the economy to decline close to simultaneously. And I think people lose track of the fact that, say, it's the medical system that's going to decline, and the healthcare system, and the higher education. And then most fossil fuels will be left in the ground because of low prices. What happens is that people need a happily ever after story. And what tends to happen is the self-organizing system sort of grabs pieces of different stories and puts them together and says, oh, we can have a happily ever after story if we assume that climate change is our biggest problem. This will take people's minds off the fossil fuel situation. If we tell them that wind and solar will solve everything, that's all they will focus on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can go back to live. Look, Gay, we have a lot of questions. So
I can't imagine how that would happen.
First of all, we cannot be able to address all the questions that we received. I would say there are, I don't know, how do you prefer? Do I have, I can mention a few questions and you say whether or not you want to make comments on it. We have one from Cynthia Aquilisi, talking about the collapse lights. That is like in Russia, they had a light collapse because they were still quite energy rich. Would be different if you have a situation which, like for instance in Europe, we do not have resources. We are importing everything. So if there is a collapse, it would be not that soft, not light. Then another question that could be related that maybe you want to address is that what would happen in China now? Because China, with the partnership with Russia and Iran, they may have formed a powerful bloc with strong economy and a large part of the remaining oil reserves. So talking about the possibility of collapse, what would be the difference between countries which still have access to oil or resources, and other countries like Europe, because Europe, the situation of Europe in terms of energy is really scary. I mean, we are importing a lot of fossil energy from elsewhere. So this would be, in the case you have some geopolitical trouble on the market and there are some serious collapse, it would be a dire situation. You want to make this to a comment on this? Then I will have other.
Well, I think one point that could be made is that collapse probably would not occur simultaneously all around the globe. What you end up with is the Yemens of the world are ones that are very close to collapse. The ones that are in really don't have very good resources are going to go down first. The Soviet Union situation was not really a full collapse. It was a collapse of the central government, but there was already a world situation around them, that could kind of lift them up. And so they could get parts from elsewhere, maybe not immediately, but they had, it was more of a partial collapse. I think that, there probably are going to be new alliances formed that will help, as you said, the China, Russia, and was it Iran? Well, some combination, different combinations to work together. But, the thing that kind of surprised people with this big Texas outage is because Texas is known as the energy capital of the US. And now if the energy capital of the US did such poor planning for their electricity supply, you're kind of going, good grief, come on now, this is just absurd. So it really depends on a lot more variables than are easy to see. The financial system is going to make a big difference in it. I could see a situation where, say, the northeast part of China, which has the old industry, which is sort of like the Rust Belt of the US, well, maybe they would not do as well as some of the southeast coast, for example. And you might end up with a smaller version of China, for instance, working with some particular pieces that work together. And you can see breakdown, different groups working together that can make it work, but it won't necessarily be exactly the groups we're thinking of today.
Okay, so now there is another couple of questions that I believe this is really important and show the importance of having a discussion with a diversity of perspectives. It is, should we worry more about biodiversity? This is Zolt and also Tommaso Luzzatti, I believe that he made a similar question. It is that, what about pollution and then the climate-led collapse, that it would be more important to look at the planetary boundary, at the essential constraints that we get, rather than always looking at societal ills. I mean, it is obvious that for us, it's more important to discuss about equity and, the well-being of humans. But it is also true that at the moment we have a very daunting challenge when looking at the feasibility of our survival, in the sense that if you're looking at the last IPBES report on the biodiversity, it is really a horror book. Nobody talk about that, but it's a horror book. How this is contributing to your analysis, because it's an additional piece of.
Well, I think the thing that it's easy to lose sight of, if you read the book Rare Earth by Ward and Brownlee, they talk about that and that was published in 2001, they talk about the fact that the Earth seems to be very unusual within the whole universe in terms of supporting life over a long period. There might be other places, you know, we don't know for sure, but there have been many, many coincidences that what look like coincidences that have allowed life to go on. And the whole system seems to have its own way of evolving that protects the system, that's allowed this growth in energy density, basically, over the period. And it's almost like there's a guiding hand behind it. We've gone through ups and downs and ins and outs. And so, you know, we humans have come along and said, well, we need to help this guiding hand. And I think, you know, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing Bill Gates, who I would say is, you know, one of the oligarchs, and many of the other oligarchs out there are busy trying to put their 2 cents into what they think needs to happen. And it's partly working through what these people say. But regardless of what we do, the system is going to pick out something that it will think works. And it may be that crashing the system, because we build such fragile systems that, you know, the nature builds very complex systems with lots of redundancies, but we humans build systems without redundancy. So what you end up with is electricity systems that fail real easily. And you end up with long distance supply lines that fail very easily. So it's going to be failure of these systems that brings it down more than some other things, perhaps.
Okay. I have a question from Sergio Grangagnolo. And he said the collapse is not a problem in the sense that we cannot solve it. It's a predicament, and more or less is an inevitability. And there are no solutions at all. So it is in between predicament and inevitability. So what are the implications of this? Should we choose to leave the things going the way they're going and see what happens, or accept one collapse after another, keeping a planet destruction ongoing, or having a collapse now and save more natural wildlife for those that will come later? That is, you know, this kind of, again, the trade-off between trying to save as much as possible our standard of living now, or being more willing to save the natural part. But if I understand from what you were saying before, you are not particularly worried about the collapse of the ecological part.
Well, what I think is that the whole system has a great deal more resilience built into it than we give it credit for. That the system is designed with a lot of variability in it, with the idea of survival of the best adapted. And, you know, if it takes 1 million years to get back to what it was before, well, 1 million years isn't a whole lot in the life of the planet. And, well, it will get back to where it was. Now, you know, we personally can go out there and say, okay, you know, but what are we really going to do? You know, what possibly are we going to do? Wind and solar are not going to be a solution. The system, if we really had a good way to fix it, that would be something else, but we really don't. You know, I guess I've been telling people that they should take advantage of what time we have right now. And, you know, while you've got money in the bank account, spend it, you know, give it to charities, or spend it on your family, or if you can travel, do the travel. But, you know, you can't really, if you can't really fix the situation, if you can find some way you can fix the situation, but it's really hard to. You can plant some trees, I guess.
Okay, and this is a classic question that in this type of discussion never always appear. Under this circumstance, how many people do you estimate there will be around in 2050? Global population. You are imagining that the population keep growing, or it will be going down?
Yeah, well, I had had something in an earlier post where I said, well, okay, if the population went down more slowly than the resources go down, then maybe you'd have, say, 2 million left, or I forget what it was, 2 or 2.5 million left out of 7.8 billion, I mean, 2.2 billion as opposed out of 7.8 billion. Even if your resources were down, maybe we would say, well, we'll give up eating meat, we'll eat food closer to home. Maybe we can get along with less. Maybe our population wouldn't go down as much as the energy would go down. But at the other end of the ranges, I don't know. It's just one of those things you don't know.
So I have one simple question that maybe you know. Can the presentation be shared with those interested? Your PowerPoint?
Yes, and well, in fact, I will make a PDF of the presentation available on my website.
Let me know. Okay.
And also, you're
making... on your website, Our Finite World.
Yeah, I'll have on Our Finite World, and I know you're making a recording available.
Yes, yes. Another question is that there are. This is Herbert Goodrich. There are any timestamps, progress marker to track. To know where and we are along the Seneca Cliff before the system collapse. Can you make any guess or any comment about that?
Well, I think that the whole thing of the pandemic tells me we're taking a big step down right now. And I think that's one of the big things, that the whole idea that we can go back after this pandemic, I think, is just wishful thinking. I think that really behind it is the fact that, the reasons that people were willing to do all of this closing of their economies and such things was because this was really a comfortable thing for these countries to do. If you're having riots in the street, and leaders can see they have riots in the street and they can't really afford to import as much oil as they're importing, they are going to, when they're faced with a epidemic which they could pay very little attention to, they are suddenly going to close their economies down. And so that's why you get the UK closing its economy down, and that's why you get all of these different countries closing their economies down. There was no real reason, apart from the short energy supply, to close these economies down.
Another question from Sarah Brandons. What concrete demands would you draw from your findings? Are you criticizing the financial system or do take it for granted?
Well, I think the financial system is necessary. And, if you don't have enough goods and resources now, you can always add more debt, basically promising people future goods and services, but those future goods and services aren't going to be there. So that's what makes the whole system not work. But you have to have a financial system. Once you get the financial system going, I think what we've discovered is you can add more and more layers to the financial system. And it gets to be more and more, oh my goodness, how in the world are they doing this? Leverage upon leverage upon leverage. But that's what they've needed to do to try to keep the system going. That's one of the big places that could fail, but I think it was necessary just to keep the thing going.
Yeah, and then this related to this, Joffre, I don't know, it depends on which country is from. Sala, do you see in the near future a deflationary scenario or inflationary one? When do you think the US dollar will collapse? Oops. Oops.
Well, I guess, because when we're talking about prices staying low, it's an inflation it's an inflation-adjusted prices. You can very well have a situation where there's so many dollars published that, in nominal dollars, it goes up. But what's in inflation-adjusted dollars, the prices are are going to tend to stay low. It could be right at the end in some places, you know, maybe you could get some spikes, but what happens is that as things break, then there's, you know, if your electric grid is down, you don't need to buy much natural gas to power it, for example. You know, as things break, you need less rather than more. So it doesn't behave quite the way you would think it would. You have to think in terms of the actual physical goods and services. As you get smaller and smaller areas working together, they are going to be able to make fewer and fewer things.
On this, I have a question from Laura Perez. They happen to know because she's one of my PhD students. And she published a very nice paper on the embodied labor in trade. So, for instance, in Europe, we are using 120 million worker equivalents, okay? 120 million worker equivalents. So the question is, if we have a problem with collapse and going in extreme stress, what happened because the economy now, the global market is a tightly networked system, and then there is a very strong connectivity, because this would be against what you were saying before, that you don't see a generalized collapse, but you will have a collapse in one place and another. Is this possible at this moment, or we are in a situation like that, what happened when they had the volcano erupting, that we couldn't do a conference here, but we couldn't get batteries from China because they stopped the air flight, in the sense that the economies are getting very, very connected. So what about the possibility of exporting the collapse in one place to another?
What's the possibility? I think that there's a real possibility of exporting the collapse from one place to another. I think, you know, for instance, this whole thing about the semiconductor chips, which are made, the good quality ones are made in Taiwan, and there are some made elsewhere. And if we're at peak semiconductor chips, we're probably at peak computers and peak phones. Okay, well then we got a problem. And so you start exporting the problem one way or the other, and it turns out the automobiles needed the really cheap semiconductors, but in the whole scheme of things, nobody wants to make cheap semiconductors when they can make expensive semiconductors. So you end up without having semiconductors needed by the automobile industry. So what happens is, oh, we can't build those cars because they don't have the semiconductors. So it gets, the whole thing kind of gets spread around by peak of different kinds of goods that we can make, and the peak, the supply lines around the world.
Yeah, an observation from Joost van der Velde, that is that if we could make people to think in terms of energy instead of money, we would be a big step in the right direction. What your comments? You agree on this fact?
Well, I think energy and the goods and services that they produce, you know, it's the two are tied together. If you have energy, they produce goods and services. If you have a smaller amount of energy, they produce a smaller amount of goods and energy. You can print all the money you want, but that doesn't get you any more goods and services unless you could actually somehow or other enable the oil producing countries or companies or whatever it is to get it back to those that need it. You know, the Middle Eastern countries especially are desperate for higher oil prices because they need the tax revenue. And that's not something that EROI looks at.
Okay, another question is, what early warning system beside you or parameter we should follow to get indication about the collapse coming? So what are the signs that we could use to detect that the collapse is close? Beside your intuition, I mean, what other things we should get worried about when we see them?
What other things should we be worried about? Oh, okay, that's a good question. Well, I think
this is Ferran Puig Villar.
What?
The name is Ferran Puig Villar. I think it's Catalan. It's one of ours. I'm in Barcelona. Yeah.
Well, I think that a big concern right now, of course, is the financial system. It seems so perilous right now. Are you asking for people you should follow, or what are you?
No, in general, say if there are some really worry, and we should be worried when we see some things happening with some.
We should be really worried when we see something happen. Well, I think, you know, all of this stuff about COVID it's a way of keeping the economy down.
Okay.
And, you know, and so you're going to find all kinds of stuff related to that, but nobody will think about that as, well, we have a group of different parts of the system fighting each other. You know, the medical system, the people making vaccines feel that they need to protect their territory. We have all of the different ones, but, you know, that's a piece people don't focus on. But there's the financial thing. It's what you do with all, we keep pushing forward and not paying all of the, well, giving some kind of alternate funding to all of these people who are without jobs, and how long can that go on?
Okay, I have another question from Roman Caruso. Do you think that the governments have a clue of the collapse you're speaking about? If yes, are they just ignoring it, or they don't want to, simply they do not know how to manage it? And this more or less was a similar question that we got from Vincent Kosic, saying that maybe they know that there is a problem, but since they don't know how to do it, they just pretend to do, they start making policy, no matter if the policies are good or bad, just to show that they are doing something.
Well, I think in fact that they do know, and it's sort of, they've been at desperation for a long time. And so they have to come up with something to show they're doing something. So what happens is they say, okay, we'll have, what we'll have is different people, excuse me, I lost my train of thought here. We have to show people we're doing something. Well, these renewable folks tell us that we can maybe do something with them. We can take some, if we can cherry pick the data, we can pick something that makes it look good from this subject area, and something that makes it look good from that subject area, and something that looks good for that subject area, and we'll subsidize that. And we will show them that we have a plan to do something. So they've known about it, and they've had to put together a story that would allow them in their own minds, as well as others, to be able to say, oh, we got it fixed, because look, we figured out that if we, you know, we have decided, we put together models assuming that growth goes on unimpeded in a finite world, just indefinitely. And based on our model, this is why you see all of these horrible things happening to the planet. You know, we have assumed that there are no automatic brakes on the things that happen. We will not trust the automatic brakes. We will put in our own brakes using a different thing. But there actually have been way too many people trying to figure out things, you know. Basically, these oligarchs want to know how they can profit from the system. And so they figure out brakes that they will profit from, you know, and we'll have the Amazons of the world, and, you know, and we'll have Bill Gates buying up farmland, and they tell people that you'll be happy without owning anything. You'll just rent it from me.
Okay, so I think that we managed. If you want, we have just one last, so you are done. What about hydrogen? This is Virginio Fanelli asking. Hydrogen.
Hydrogen, well, this is an energy carrier, and trying to get to even develop the hydrogen and then to transport it any place, and how to keep it from escaping from where you need it from. It really, every time anybody has looked at hydrogen, it doesn't really get you anywhere.
Okay. So, Gail, thank you very much. It's been exhausting. You did a marathon, but you did very well. There are some other announcements that I'm supposed to do for the Uncomfortable Knowledge Hub. Again, we are just starting now. Please, those that didn't do it, try to look at our quantitative storytelling that we have in our website. And if you like something, or if you want to do comments and you want to get involved in trying to have, like we had today, different opinion, expanding perspectives, rather than just having discussion among experts on specific numbers. Please try to join us in this attempt. Okay, so nice for coming, and we will try to do another webinar soon with some other guru of quantitative storytelling like Gail. Okay. Gail, do you want to say hello to everybody?
Oh, I wanted to thank Mario for putting this together and all the work he's done on this, and for the feedback he's been giving me and things like that. And I enjoyed having this opportunity. Thanks to everyone.
Perfect, Tom. Okay, so guys, see you for the next appointment. Bye.
Okay. Bye.